Born on a Thursday by Lapsus_Calamy, read by AJ Morningstar / Supernova Podfic. Chapter 2. The apartment felt creepy, smothered in a sense of utter wrongness. Actually, Styles thought it might be the whole building. The weird tingling was similar to what he often felt at the Hale house, something Sinead had told him was his spark's reaction to the amount of death. Considering the lack of deaths in the building, it was unexpected. Styles took a steadying breath, counted, and did his best to focus. Once they were settled, John decided they could look over the building again. Surprisingly, he sent Styles with Dean. The two of them signed to the top 2 floors while John covered the bottom 2. Dean looked less pleased with the arrangement than Styles was. Styles actually wondered if it was meant to be a sort of punishment to Dean, considering the look John gave his son before leaving. Regardless, Styles had more than enough practice dealing with Jackson. Dean would be a piece of cake. Dean shoved an EMF detector in his hands roughly with a terse, "Know what this is?" Styles nodded, reciting the summary of what he'd read earlier that day about electromagnetic field spirits can cause energy fluctuations that can be detected with one of these. Styles, he said, waving the device. Dean grunted and led the way down the hall with his own EMF. Styles following close behind, watching the lights on his EMF reader. "So, are you going to hate me the whole time, or is this like a limited time offer?" Styles asked. Dean turned, narrowing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I'm sorry," Styles said, feigning innocence. "I thought you were being a rude jackass to me, but maybe that's just your permanent state of being." "Oh, that's hilarious," Dean muttered. "Seriously, what are you doing here? Choosing to hunt like this? No one in their right mind chooses this." "Well, I did," Styles said. "Don't you like hunting?" "Sure, I love it, but I'm a little twisted," Dean said with a laugh. Styles paused, looking up at Dean seriously. "How do you know I'm not a little twisted too?" Dean shrugged and started walking again. "You must be if you decided you wanted to come to Dad to learn about ghosts and shit." Styles considered that, deciding, yeah, he was a little twisted. Little did Dean know, the twisted part of him wasn't his decision to come to the Winchesters. No, the twisted part of him went much deeper and much darker than that. They turned the corner, still nothing registering on the EMFs, and Styles stopped. A soft whisper drifted down the hallway, resounding against the walls for an odd sort of echo. Styles breathed out slowly, ice slithering along his spine and hairs pricking up on the back of his neck. Styles jerked, looking around, staring at the wall and the grate at the bottom. "Styles, what?" "I'm not sure," Styles said, swallowing and focusing on keeping himself settled among the feelings resonating against his spark. "Do you smell that?" Dean asked, walking closer and taking a deep breath through his nose. Styles sniffed, trying to place the strange odor. "What is that? Gas?" Dean shook his head, frowning in puzzlement. "Nah, it's something else. Can't put my finger on it." Styles crouched, staring intently at the grate and moving his EMF reader in front of it. The lights lit up, the reader beginning to squeal. Styles flicked it off, annoyed at the sound, as Dean crouched beside him. "Muzzle tov," the hunter said, grinning. "You just found your first spirit. Inside a vent?" Styles asked. Dean nodded. Styles just sighed. Life shouldn't be able to surprise him like this anymore. Of course. Dean fished out a flashlight and shined it into the grate. "Here," he said gruffly, shoving it at Styles and barely waiting for him to take the light before letting go. One of Dean's extensive Mary Poppins pockets, he produced a screwdriver and quickly unfastened the grating before pulling it off the wall. He reached in without hesitation, feeling around blindly with a hand. "Aren't you afraid of, getting that bit off or something?" Styles asked, feeling a little vicariously trepidatious. Dean rolled his eyes. "There's something in here," he said, meeting Styles' gaze for, the first time. He frowned, pulling his hand out. Holding a bloody clump of brown hair, he wrinkled his nose a bit. "Someone's keeping souvenirs." Styles gagged, averting his eyes. "Oh, gross." Dean chuckled, still holding the hair and expecting it curiously. You actually squeamish?" "Just with some things," Styles said, trying not to look at the hair. "God, can you, put it back or throw it away?" Styles Dean waved it closer to Styles' face, expression lighting up with almost childlike glee at Styles' recoil. He cackled and pulled the hair away, tucking it into his pocket. "You're a jackass," Styles muttered, standing. Dean pursed his lips, nodding in agreement. "That is true. Come on, let's sweep the rest of the floor, then head back. Once my dad is done, we can fill him in." Styles frowned at the screen in front of him, pictures of the block from the early 90s, trying. 1900s, trying to determine what exactly had been in the field had taken most of the night, but Styles had finally figured it out. The apartment was built on ground that had served as an execution area throughout the 1800s, which, talk about disturbing. It had taken Styles a little over 2 hours to compose a list of everyone executed, then half an hour to filter out those who were cremated. After that, the slow process of weeding through MOs to compare the past cases with the present. And now he was back to staring at street photographs. Dean groaned from his position on the leather couch where he crashed around 2 in the morning. John had gone down around 3:30, taking the only bed and leaving the love seat to Styles. If Styles had ever intended to go to sleep, which he had not. Dean sat up with another groan rubbing at his eyes. He looked over at Styles, cocking his head in confusion as he peered into the empty bedroom. "Morning," Styles said, not looking away from the images and trying to synthesize the street in his mind. "Where's my dad?" Dean asked, voice still sounding rough from sleep. "Coffee run," Styles answered. Dean stood slowly, stretching his back like a cat, an old and bedraggled cat. "Ugh, I hate sleeping on couches. How was the love seat?" "Wouldn't know," Styles said, tapping on the touchpad impatiently and swiping his finger across the pad to enlarge the image. Dean frowned. "You didn't sleep?" "Nope," Styles said, popping the pea a little bit. "Then what did you do?" Dean said, sounding, for some reason, a little angry. Styles sighed while contemplating an acceptable answer, but was interrupted, or maybe saved, from replying by John throwing open the door. "Hey, Dad, where's the coffee?" "There are cops outside," John said. "Another boy disappeared." Styles looked up, the bottom of his stomach falling out. For some reason, he'd assumed if he was in the building, the other boys would be safe. "What?" "Dave, Hogman, apartment 2F, father reported him missing this morning," John said. Dean nodded. "The apartment, same cracks on the walls and ceilings, ectoplasm too," John said. "Between that and the hair tuft you two found, I'd say the spirit's coming from the walls." "But who is it?" Dean said, the table to look at the notes. "Building's history is totally clean." Styles cleared his throat. "About that, what?" "And don't say you missed something in your impeccable research," Dean said. Styles shook his head, turning his computer so the screen was facing the other men. "No, we might be looking in the wrong place." John leaned closer, peering at the black and white photograph displayed. "What do you mean?" Dean asked, mimicking his father's movement. "It's just an empty field." "Yeah, it's where this building was built. Look at the one next door," Styles said. "Bars," Dean said. "Next door was a prison," John concluded, shooting a questioning look at Styles. Moyama Singh Prison, built in 1835 and torn down in 1963. They used to execute people by hanging them in the empty field next door," Styles said. "We need a list of everyone executed here," John said. Styles pulled the computer around, clicking a few windows closed. "Done already," he said, presenting the list he'd compiled to the hunters. 157. Dean whistled lowly. "We gotta narrow that down." "Any of them cremated?" John asked. "Already removed," Styles said. "I've been comparing MOs. There's a couple that match, but one in particular." He clicked open more windows. "Matches almost perfectly right down to his victim preference. Stephen Kraft, convicted of 17 murders, suspected of nearly 230. "Stephen Kraft?" Dean said. "Wasn't he?" "Yeah," Styles said. "Cannibal who preyed on boys between the ages of 13 and 25. Slender build, brown or black hair, brown or hazel or gray eyes. He was executed at Moyam Singh on May 17th, 1896. He used chloroform to subdue his victims and kill them," Dean said, "which is what I smelled in the hallway last night. Where is he buried?" Styles sighed. "Chicago." but he's encased in a couple tons of concrete to keep people from mutilating or sexually using his corpse because, it's what he'd do. Well, that's perfect, Dean said as John swore. Styles winced. We might have a bigger problem. How? Dean said. How does it get bigger? Styles glanced at John, calculating John's knowledge of the serial killer. The older man seemed to know what Styles was going to say before he said it. Kraft had an apartment building in Chicago. It was a death factory, a maze of trapdoors and acid vats, secret chambers in the walls. Think Saw, too. He'd lock some of his victims in, keeping them alive for days until they suffocated or starved. So Dave could still be alive, stuck in the walls, Dean asked. We need sledgehammers and crowbars. We've got to smash these walls anywhere thick enough to hide a boy, John said. Let's go. Styles didn't think he'd hate anything in his life as much as he hated the suffocating feeling of the walls closing in on him. The crawl spaces he and Dean were shuffling through were barely big enough for Dean's 6-foot frame. Combined with the dim lighting and increasingly malevolent feeling of the building, Styles was clinging to his calmness with the figurative tips of his fingers. He and Dean were 3/4 of the way through the walls on the 4th floor while John was working through the 1st floor, so far none of them had found anything to suggest the boys had ever been in the walls. Honestly, Styles doubted the boys were here in these walls. Surely someone would have heard or smelled something. Hell, he doubted they were still even alive, although that consideration sank his already low spirits. Okay, call after you check the south wall, Dean said before snapping his phone shut. Dad's done with the 1st floor. Hasn't found jack squat either. Shit. What is it? Styles asked, proud. His voice sounded entirely steady. He was kind of concerned that all he'd be able to verbalize was a nearly inaudible squeak. It's too narrow. Can't go any further, Dean said, shining his light further down the wall. Let me see, Styles said, squeezing past Dean and ignoring the other man's grunt of annoyance. The walls moved closer together, and yeah, no way Dean was fitting through there. Him, on the other hand, it'd be a tight squeeze, but he could probably fit. Dean was right. Shit, I can fit, Styles said. Dean shook his head. You're not going in there by yourself. You got a better idea? Styles asked, half hoping Dean would, because he really did not want to go down there. Of course not, Styles muttered. Okay. He pushed forward, fighting the squeeze of the building. Fighting the sneeze he felt building. Dust filtered down around his head and clogging in his nose and throat. It was a tight fit, his chest and back scraping along the dirty walls as he inched along. Hey, Dean called as Styles approached a turn. What's your number? Styles recited his number for Dean before continuing along the wall. As soon as he was out of sight, he felt his phone vibrate and answered with a huff, twisting himself in a cheap imitation of a contortionist to fish it from his pocket in the tight quarters. You and your dad keep a tight leash, he said. Yeah, it's called keeping you alive. Find anything aside from a whole new level of claustrophobia? No. Where are you? Styles shifted, trying to orient himself. It looked like an air duct opened up in a few steps in front of him, leading down to the 3rd floor. Along the north wall. There's an air duct, he grunted, lowering himself down carefully, a true testament of skill, what with not dropping himself or his phone. I'm heading down. No. Stay up here, Styles huffed, bracing himself and closing his eyes. He wished he had his hands free enough to count. Look, we have to find this boy, don't we? I'm okay. Dean was quiet for a long moment. You're an idiot. All right, I'm heading to you. Styles dropped down to the lower floor, which, surprise, surprise, looked just like the floor above it. Maybe a bit dirtier, if that was possible. He pressed on studiously, ignoring the walls around him and the amount of dirt he'd accumulated on his clothes and face. He walked right into a spider web, letting out a huff of disgust as he tried to brush it off his face with little success. He shuddered, feeling like insects were crawling over his skin, which was entirely possible. A quiet whisper had him freezing, the same feeling from the other day creeping up the back of his neck. Oh my God, he whispered, watching the thick black goo begin to pour out of the cracks in the walls. He drew his hands away, already knowing it was a fruitless action. Dean responded quickly. What is it, Styles? The hand that grabbed him and covered his mouth came out of seemingly nowhere, along with the overwhelming odor of gas, chloroform, his brain supplied unhopefully, and it was the last conscious thought he was aware of. What is it, Styles? Dean said urgently, running along the walls now and trying to figure out where the kid was. The cut off scream spurred him into action, slamming the sledgehammer into the wall and poking his head through. The lit screen of Styles' phone was all that greeted him, along with traces of ectoplasm. Dean swore colorfully, pocketing the phone and dialing his father. Dad, get up here. Third floor. He took Styles. John didn't reply, just hung up with a click. But Dean knew he was on his way. John was striding down the hallway in minutes, content in a storm of fury. What happened? He demanded. Dean swallowed, glancing at the empty hole in the wall. It was slightly surprising, but losing Styles to Kraft almost felt on par with the time Sam had run away without a word to Dean. The same twisting sense of dread and guilt was crawling through him. I wasn't with him. I left him alone. I'm sorry. Dean, I told you to keep him with you. John shined his light into the wall, looking for anything that might be helpful in locating Styles. I know. The walls got too narrow. I wouldn't fit, but he did, so he went and... Damn it, Dean shouted, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Dean, calm down. We'll find him. Where? Dean said. Inside the walls? Because we've been inside the walls all night. None of the other boys were there. Dean, John repeated, we'll find him. He shouldn't have been here, Dean said. He's just a kid. John sighed and clenched his jaw. We'll find him.